Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products. Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and I'm here again this week with our colleagues Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, and Gail Carpenter, Assistant Professor and State Dairy Extension Specialist, as we introduce the third virtual discussion on successful forage feeding. So welcome back to the podcast, Gail and Fred.
Great to be here as always, Jen.
Always enjoy visiting. And, last night we had a super program. Everything we've presented so far has really had producer interest and great conversation. And last night was no different.
I agree, Fred. We really had some great discussion, a lot of themes that timed in with some of the other topics that we've discussed in the past couple weeks. And it was really great to get the industry perspective as well as the academic perspective from Dr. Ferraretto as well.
So this was our third virtual discussion, and it was surrounding forage storage. So tell us who your presenters were and where that discussion led.
Yeah, so we had Dr. Luiz Ferraretto from UW-Madison Extension. He presented on some best practices for storing silage. And then we also had Ron and Connie Kuber of Connor Agriscience out in California. They have a company out there, and so they work with a lot of large dairies out in California and all over the United States as well. They're, three experts in the field of silage storage.
A lot of our producers will recognize the product, the CO Pro product that covers a lot of their piles. I know here in Northwest Iowa, I'm sure Connie and Ron spend a lot of time because a lot of their product covers piles up here.
And I know Ron and Connie also talk about safety as well, right? During corn silage season. So was that a topic of discussion there last night too?
Yep, we hit some best practices when it comes to silage safety and bunker safety. Always really important, especially as we're getting into the time of year where we have harvest going on and there's a lot of large equipment driving around and people tend to get a little bit maybe complacent sometimes or tired, and it's easy to get fatigued and kind of, start cutting corners. And so we had some really great reminders about silage safety and making sure that you're working as a team to make safety a priority.
They worked with Dr. Bolson from Kansas, and I think they now distribute some of his material as well as a really neat coloring book for kids that focuses on silage safety. We're family businesses out there. So the kids are right there in the cab with us around the equipment. So the fact that they have put something together to help reinforce that stuff is dangerous, be aware and be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's great. And for our audience, we are going to include the discussion here towards the end of our conversation, and then we'll include the archived webinar as well as the registration link yet for the last upcoming webinar. So Gail, can you tell us what's going to be coming up next week as our final webinar discussion?
Yeah, I'm really excited for next week's discussion. We've spent some time talking about harvest, talking about cover crops, talking about storage. And what we're really going to focus on next week is that, that time from bunk to cow, right? So the feeding side of things and what happens from the moment you remove forages from the bunker, wherever you're storing it, to the time that the cow is actually consuming that ration. So we're going to kind of wrap it up with that discussion. I'm really excited for our speakers next week. We have Dave and Ethan Weiss from Foresight Farms up in the Decorah area. They're going to be talking about what they do on their farm. If you've ever had a chance to visit their farm, they just have a great setup. They're really detail oriented, just very progressive, do a fantastic job up there. And we're also going to have their nutritionist, Jordan Hunt from GPS Dairy Consulting, is going to be joining as well. So we're going to have the producer side as well as the nutritionist side, hoping for some really great discussion. and good reminders of best practices and for some great Q&A again.
Sounds good. Any last comments, Fred, before we conclude?
Well, I think that the folks who've attended these presentations walked away with some really good information. And I like to remind the listeners that if you're interested, these are archived along with the podcast. The webinars are on our website. They can access any or all of them and listen to the complete program.
All right, well, let's tune in as Gail and Fred discuss with Luiz Ferraretto from the University of Wisconsin Extension and Ron and Connie Kuber of Connor Agriscience. And we look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
I'd like to go ahead and kick off with a question, maybe a little bit, big picture before we get started. When you're working with producers, with farms, specifically regarding storage of forages and silages in particular, what are some red flags and green flags that you tend to see? What are some things that, your top couple this is a sign that something's not quite right here, and what is your sign that these people have it under control, they're doing a good job, this is really well managed?
Go ahead, Luis, do you want to take a shot at that? I'm sure you've seen plenty.
I think it depends on what we are trying to determine, but I think it's very obvious when you arrive in a dairy about how the silage quality is, right? We don't necessarily need to have a full laboratory analysis to say, hey, this is amazing, or, probably there is something here that you have to consider, right? In terms of fermentation quality, obviously, smell, color, if you have any seepage in the floor, how dry it is, the material, if the cows are truly consuming that or not, how the leftovers are, and things like that give you a very good perspective on how the management was, not the specific details, but give you at least an initial picture that you can work with and determine, okay, so what's next, right?
Something that I tell our guys to do is that when you're driving on, before you even look at the silage pile, look at the cows, because the cows will tell you how they're doing. And if they're thin, if they're overfed, how much feed is left in that bunk. So that's what I always tell people. Look at the cows first. They'll tell you exactly what's going on.
We have some independent reps that work with our dairy producers in the field, and that's very important to consideration for them to start there. And then the next thing we look for is a feed inventory on that, because we see there's things are out of balance for the time of year. That's an indication to me that there was maybe a disconnect in the planning from the previous seasons on there. And now we've got in our areas, we can add almond hulls, we can bring a lot of byproducts in and make some substitutions. In your backyard there in the Midwest and East, if you run out of corn silage, you don't have a lot of options on there. So that makes it even more important further east, I think, to be able to make sure that they're monitoring the plan and following it through.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Hutchins, we'll let you go, and then we have another question that popped up in the chat.
Yeah, let me do a couple quick questions. Connie, to go quick here. First of all, maybe it's just my ignorance, but when you say hem versus overlap, what is the hem and what is the overlap in that bunker or that pile?
You want to take the honey?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the overlap is going to be where the two, we recommend a 6-foot overlap from one film to the other. And then the hem would be the 3 foot of plastic out beyond the silage that would allow you to put weight on there. And that was a very good point to catch, that we didn't clarify that in the beginning. Thank you, Dr. Hutchins.
My second quick question, so I won't take too much time, and that is when you do the boot or the tractor tires, what is your goal? Do you want to see tractor tires or not see tractor tires on the surface of the pile? Or if I'm standing there as a boot, do I want to sink in, or how much do I sink in? Any guidelines on that?
Well, you don't want to sink in at all, and that's just that would be the ideal situation. But I think in terms of seeing tire tracks, if the piles that I have seen, as I walked away from and said, hey, from top to bottom, They paid attention to the details. They made a plan. They followed through on it, and that's where they're doing what Connie had talked about, going forward, reverse, repeat. And as they're just moving ever so much, maybe a tire track, only a half a tire track at a time over. And so you're eliminating the tire tracks because you're not, you're going at a very slow control pace to pack, not just to be taking a sightseeing tour on the top of the silage pile.
Then I'm going to go to Luis to get you in trouble here. An interesting question. If I've got 7-8% organic acids, that means that starch and sugar, I can't use my rumen microbes. So can I have too much acid in my silage? Then I'm cheating my rumen microbes so they cannot produce amino acids, for example. Your thoughts on that?
I think everything depends on what is the profile of those acids as well, right? I think with corn silage, you're not going to reach levels of organic acids that are, let's say, dangerous for bugs, for example, right? And this is similar to a lot of the discussion that we have about, well, if you have a lot of acetic acid, what happens to intake, right? I think it depends what is producing those acids and what is the relationship between those different acids in terms of how that would create a problem, right? I think the most important is if you have very good fermentation and silage is properly preserved, you are making sure that the cows will consume that, right? I don't think you have drops in intake, and I think that the rumen metabolism will still be properly done because you're going to dilute a lot of that silage with other feeds, including concentrates that will help with that part of the process.
My last question for Louise, and that is, maybe you've seen Rick Grant when he uses the 4mm screen on the Penn State box, and he's calling that effective fiber. What's your feeling on that feed from on the 4mm box? I understand the 8 and the 19, but the 4mm box, he used that in his calculations for his physically effective fiber calculation. What's your thoughts on that? I just wonder, 4mm is not very long.
No, 4mm is not very long. I think that the important thing to remember is you don't want particles that are too long that cows can select, right? And you don't want particles that are too short that will pass too fast and not provide enough effective fiber. The way I see the 4mm sieve is it provides a little bit of effective fiber, but it's not the 8mm fiber, right? I think you need to have enough 8 to 19mm fiber particles. Just to give you a perspective on that, I collaborate in a project in Brazil this past year where we actually separated those particles from corn silage, and we fed a basal corn silage diet plus above the 19, between the 8 and 19, and below the 8mm sieve. And what we saw is the 8mm particles add to the diet create more effective fiber than any other treatment, including those particles below. So we have to be careful with anything below 8, because in my opinion, the true effective fiber is 8 to 19 with a little bit of help from the other sieves.
Thank you.
Okay, let's kind of give a perspective question, and this will be for everybody. What storage practice has the highest return on investment for producers to get right?
I think packing density, which is related to a lot of other things, dry matter, chop length, et cetera, and then properly sealing to minimize oxygen on there. And
he was asking which storage.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you talking about as far as which storage, whether a bunker or a drive over pile? Is that what you're referring to?
No, practice. And you could take it from starting the pile, getting the right size, all the way to, how we pack it or how we face it when we're feeding off the pile.
Oh, well, I'll back up and I'll just say make a good plan based on the right information from your nutritionist, and make sure that everyone understands what the objective is and are committed to get there.
Common theme the past few weeks.
Something too that I'm sorry, Luis, if you mentioned this, but we haven't talked about kernel processing. And that's something that's really, really important too. It's a detail, but being able to use that starch in that corn silage is pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree completely. Processing to me for corn silage is the most important part of the process. There are so many things that affect that. But, I think the most important thing that we have to remember is the word consistency. Cows like consistency. They are grumpy like me. They want to get to their feed and eat exactly what they are used to. They don't want surprises there. So, you need to make sure your entire harvesting season is properly done, because if there are parts of the season where, you don't have the correct particle size, proper kernel processing, weird type of fermentation, all of this will create problems because cows will notice, and they will notice that fast. So I think if I could choose something, I'd say, hey, pay attention to your consistency, and preferably to the good consistency, right? We don't want bad consistency because they will not like either. So
we have a question in the chat here. And I think, Luis, you'll be, well, anybody can answer this, but this kind of ties in with what Luis was talking about with inoculant. Any comments on how additives that are chemical oxygen scavengers compared to heterofermented for bacteria?
Yeah, I think every technology has its own space and opportunities, right, where they can shine. I think in crops like high moisture corn and corn silage, I think inoculants, at least from my perspective, are more desired because they will help with certain parts of fermentation, right? Modulate the fermentation towards what we want, right? Chemical additives, usually they have potential to actually inhibit some of the fermentation, right? So because of that, you can have both ways, right? You may not achieve the exactly fermentation that you want, even though you're inhibiting the undesired fermentation. For example, I think that propionic acid is great for when you are insiling wet brewer's grain, for example, because you want to keep your wet brewer's grain for a little bit longer, right? But I don't think propionic acid is great for corn silage. I would prefer a good inoculant that will boost my fermentation early on, or will help with the acetic acid and aerobic stability later on. So I think you have to evaluate for each scenario, what do you think is best? What are the issues associated with that? And which technology fits best with your goals?
Okay, I'm going to move back to some terminology. Explain what asphalt top concrete should look like.
Well, I'll just give you, this was something there was a contractor that started doing, I saw that this was up in the Hillmore area. Shortly after Hillmore cheese got going, a lot of the dairies there started making some investments in their infrastructure. And one of the things they started doing was replacing their concrete walled silage bunkers, and then started putting down dry pads for putting dry over piles, which gave them more flexibility. And there was and I remember going there and seeing this just absolutely slick surface. And I was just absolutely amazed. And I said, well, how old is this? And they said, well, it's 15 years old. And I couldn't believe it and what it was, and I actually ended up having met the contractor who did it. And he used concrete as a base. So it was well packed. Everything was, and then well packed base, concrete. He built it like a road effectively. And then the capping with the asphalt protected the concrete from the silage acids. And so after 15 years, and this was 15 years ago, I think I was out there this last year, and that's still, you could drive remote control race cars down there with, without getting them, flipped into concrete pits.
Luis, you talked about dry matter when making harvesting decisions. You talked a lot about the importance of maturity and also the importance of proper dry matter. And maybe we've got a little bit of conflict going on, or a little bit of drama here, because we had Dr. Mahana on a couple weeks ago now, and he said that as long as the corn plant is healthy, we can ignore dry matter altogether. So he's not here to defend himself, but I wonder if you'd like to weigh in on that. And I see that the Kubers are kind of smirking themselves a little bit too, if they wanna chime in on that as well.
Of course, I will start defending Bill so he doesn't complain with me later, and then after that I attack him a little bit, if that's okay.
Fine by me.
So I think what Bill was trying to say was, if you have healthy plants and good management, waiting a little bit to harvest is not as bad as it would be as if you have issues with management. That very likely you're going to have a delay because of, I don't know, maybe the custom harvester, rain, anything that you cannot control, right? So, but from my perspective, I see maturity this way. The more the plant matures, less digestible is fiber, less digestible is starch, regardless of kernel processing. Chemically, that's how it works. It's plant physiology, and I don't think Bill will disagree with that. Right? Obviously, there are scenarios that change a little bit. there are certain dry matter and kernel dry matter maturities where you can still process silage well, and there are others that you cannot, right? Even if you have very good processing, very good monitoring during harvest, etc. I think part of the issue that I see is when we target for late maturity corn silage, any issue that we have will put the vast majority of our silage in the very upper end where it's harder to break kernels. Okay, some people consider that, well, we can shatter better kernels. That's not true at all. Okay, I highly disagree with that. You may be lucky and be able to do that, but the vast majority of dairies will not. It will end up with a lot of intact kernels, right? So that's why I think we have to be careful even when we have healthy plants. Of course, that if you have a great field, this gives you more flexibility on how to harvest and when to harvest. So from that perspective, I do not disagree with him.
Yeah, I thought I was when he first threw that out, I was a little bit taken aback, and then I got to thinking about it some more, and it does put a bit different perspective on it. But I think a big part of it was, I think what I understood him to say is that with the high value of the starch from the corn, from the kernels, getting an extra point by going to 3/4 or even black layer, that economic benefit, offsets, as long as the plant is healthy. And I think that's the big, that's the big caveat there is as long as the plant is healthy, your risk of letting it go a few extra days is low.
He did emphasize that point, the importance of a plant that's not stressed, a healthy plant. So excellent responses.
Let's consider this year's crop for the next question. What are you seeing out there? I know we're from across the country, but what is striking you? And let's go ahead and start with Luiz.
I haven't traveled much this silage season, but the few fields that I saw, they look in good shape. I'm actually happy with the current crop. I do think we'll have good silage, especially good corn silage, right? I don't think we had any main weather issues as we had the previous, let's say 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, right? It's kind of cyclic. So I expect the silage to be a little bit better than we saw the last maybe 2-3 years. Although I do think the last year we had a very good crop, except that some dairies saw lower starch digestibility than usual for whatever reason that we don't know how to explain.
In the last 3 weeks, let's see, I think I've been seeing corn in Missouri, Arizona, California, and Washington State, and everyone's got different challenges. I mean, in Missouri, the southeast or southwestern Missouri, they were just in an absolute almost panic because of the drought conditions that were there. They fortunately got a little bit of rain here a week and a half ago, but before that, they were really it was just burning up, and there was very little whole plant moisture. So those are the cases that were certain. Depending on where you were, there were some plants that were not healthy. Arizona, if they had water, they had a good crop, and they were taking really good care of it. Again, because the limitation of water, same situation in California. I was just up around the Moses Lake Sunnyside area where there's some feedlots and dairies up there. Their crop looked good and healthy, and they were just getting ready to start into some of those fields up there. I mentioned that yesterday I did have a pre-harvest meeting in Tulare, and one of the things that came up was about the new recommendations on evaluation of a processing score, where instead of 70 being the target, 75 is now the target, or that's what's being proposed. And one of the things that came up in that discussion was, instead of having, I think there were three levels, minimal or adequate, optimum, adequate, and not acceptable. Maybe there should include one in there between that 50 and 60. Maybe it'll be listed as marginal. And again, but those numbers have been improving, which is indicative of the way the industry has paid attention to that, whether it's the dairymen, nutritionists, or the custom harvesters that are focusing on that, and the results are, the education is getting out there. So
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to include another category there. And just one comment, I think kernel processing score is a great tool, right? And definitely help us to move forward with processing. But there is something that we have to consider is that like every other laboratory assay, there are flaws with that, right? So for example, if you harvest immature silage where the kernels are too soft, sometimes they don't break, right? Sometimes they will be smashed. And even though they are completely open and the starch available for digestion, when you run those through kernel processing score assays, it's going to look like the processing was awful, right? And sometimes this is not true. So I think we need to combine numbers with the visual because the kernel processing score does not tell the whole story, right? The other thing that is important to remember is when the assay was developed, this was to indicate kernels broken in theoretically 4 pieces, right? Well, maybe you're going to have silage that is, I don't know, let's just throw a random number here, 85% less than 4 pieces with broken into more than 4 pieces, right? But maybe you have a silage that is actually broken into 70%, but the kernel is so shattered that is actually more digestible. So we have to combine the visual with the number because there is more to that than the kernel processing score. Nothing against the assay, I think is great and recommend that. I just think we have to combine different technologies, including, I think Bill mentioned during his discussion, the silage cup that they have. Any assay similar to that, right? We suggest that too, some sort of flotation where you separate kernels and you actually see that to make sure those are broken, or if they are not broken, at least they are smashed, so you have a good perspective on that. Because the kernel processing score will come back after you send the sample to the lab, silage season will be over, so you have to watch that before. So
yeah, that's a great reminder. All right, and this has been really great discussion, but we are at almost 8:30 or 5:30 your time, I guess, in California. So don't worry, time hasn't flown that fast. I saw Ron kind of give me a surprise look. So any, kind of to wrap this discussion up, any final words of wisdom when it comes to, looking at not just this year's corn silage harvest that's coming up within the next, is already happening for some people, or coming up very shortly for others, not even just this year's harvest, but looking ahead to learning from what we did this year and looking into planning for next year. Any last thought from Luiz or the Kubers?
no, the only thing I would reiterate is, remember consistency, year after year or within a season is very important, right? I always joke about consistency, saying that, there are small herds in Brazil that the cows are used to milk very well when there is Brazilian country music playing during the milking time. And if you turn off the radio a day, everything is a mess. Right? It's not because they love Brazilian country music, it's simply because they are adapted to that, and everything that changes their routine goes very bad. So remember the word consistency, because regardless of what you do, dairy cows, nutrition and management, I do think is a good way that you can ensure good practice as well as a good outcome.
My closing thought would be to going back to making a plan, evaluate where, what the situation that you've had, and look at what are the steps that we can take to improve the situation. You can plan for a perfect outcome, but be grateful for making progress towards that outcome, and consider, taking baby steps. Because if you could do everything perfect the first year, and Nick, maybe you found the magic solution there. Congratulations and kudos. But if you at least make some progress on getting some more cost-effective feed, then this discussion has been helpful. So good luck.
I would add that being the consistency is absolutely right on, and making a plan. And like Ron said, if you try to improve on a few things each year. And harvest is such an out of ordinary activity. It's something that we don't do every day. It's not like milking cows or feeding calves or that kind of thing. It's something that's different, and it's a marathon. It's a long process, and don't give up. The ones the people who get a medal at a marathon are the people that cross the finish line. So cross the finish line, do all the steps that you plan to do, and do the best with what you can. That's something that Ron and I, we've worked for a long time together, and it's it's doing the best you can with what you have. So good luck, have fun, enjoy the process.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.